The boy stands outside a workhouse gate in the fog, holding his mother's hand, though she does not quite seem to know he is there anymore. He is 7 years old. The clothes he wears do not fit him. Inside that building, the rules are simple and cold. Families are separated the moment they enter. Men to one side, women to another, children somewhere else entirely. He does not cry. He has already learned that crying changes nothing. What he does instead, standing in that gray London morning, is watch. The way people move, the way they hide their fear behind small gestures, the way dignity survives even here in a place built to strip it away. He does not know it yet, but this habit of watching will one day make him the most famous face on earth. Good morning, and thank you for spending this time with me. Today, we're going to walk through the life of Charlie Chaplin, a life that began in almost unimaginable poverty and somehow became one of the great success stories of the 20th century. If you enjoy stories about people who built something lasting out of very little, I hope you'll stay with us and consider following along for more. Charles Spencer Chaplin was born in 1889 in Walworth, South London, into a world of music halls, gaslight, and grinding poverty. His parents were both performers, his father a singer with a fading career and a growing drinking problem, his mother a talented actress named Hannah, whose voice, on her best nights, could hold a room silent. But their marriage did not last, and neither did Hannah's health. By the time Charlie was old enough to understand what was happening around him, his mother's mind had begun to fail her. The stress of poverty, the loss of work, the disappearance of his father from their lives, it all wore her down until she was, more than once, taken to an asylum, leaving young Charlie and his older half-brother Sidney to fend for themselves. They slept where they could. They ate when they could. For a time, the workhouse was the only roof they had. It would be easy to imagine such a childhood producing bitterness. But something else happened instead. Charlie began to perform, first out of necessity, filling in for his mother on stage when her voice gave out one night. A boy of 5 doing impressions to a delighted crowd while she stood in the wings, too unwell to finish the show herself. He discovered in that moment something he would carry for the rest of his life. That laughter could be a kind of shelter, but the world outside the theater was not so easily charmed. Harder years were still ahead. By his early teens, Charlie was working steadily in music halls and touring stage productions, developing the physical comedy that would later define him. The exaggerated walk, the perfect timing, the ability to make an audience laugh and ache in the same breath. He joined a well-known theatrical troupe, and by 19, he was touring America. Still just another performer among many, still unknown to the wider world. Perhaps you've known someone like this. Someone who worked for years in the background before anyone noticed what they were capable of. Charlie spent those years sharpening something the industry didn't yet have a name for. He was patient. He watched people. He understood, better than almost anyone around him, that comedy lived not in the joke itself, but in the small, human truths beneath it. The fear of failure, the hope for dignity, the absurdity of pretending everything is fine when it isn't. In 1913, an American film studio took a chance on him. He signed with Keystone Studios, and the following year, a costume assembled almost by accident, a tight coat, baggy trousers, oversized shoes, a small mustache, and a battered bowler hat, gave birth to a character who would outlive him by generations. The Tramp. He did not yet know what that character would become. Neither did anyone else. The Tramp was an unlikely hero for the times. Poor, often hungry, frequently outmatched by the world around him, and yet endlessly resourceful, endlessly hopeful, endlessly dignified in the face of humiliation. Audiences everywhere recognized something of themselves in him. He was the immigrant, the laborer, the person who had lost everything and kept walking anyway. Cane twirling, chin held just a little too high. Within a few short years, Charlie Chaplin was not simply popular. He was, by some estimates, the most famous man alive. His films crossed language barriers effortlessly because the Tramp never needed to speak. In an era before sound had come to cinema, that silence became his greatest strength. But fame did not erase the years that came before it. Those who knew him described a man who remained underneath the success, deeply private, even guarded. Perhaps that isn't surprising when you have spent your childhood learning that comfort can vanish overnight. It is hard to fully believe, even years later, that it won't happen again. He built an empire from nothing, and still, the hardest test of his life was not behind him. It was still coming. When the world changed the rules, by the late 1920s, sound had arrived in film, and many of the silent era's greatest stars found their careers ending almost overnight. Chaplin resisted for years, insisting that the Tramp belonged to silence, to gesture, to the universal language of the body, rather than the specific accent of any one tongue. When he finally did speak on screen, in 1940s, The Great Dictator, it was not a small thing. It was a direct challenge to fascism, delivered at genuine personal and professional risk, at a time when many in his industry stayed carefully silent. Later years brought new hardships, political suspicion during the anti-communist fervor of post-war America, public controversy over his personal life, and eventually, in 1952, something that must have felt like history repeating itself. He was effectively barred from returning to the United States, the country where he had built his entire career and where he had lived for over 40 years. Imagine that for a moment. A man who had risen from a London workhouse to become one of the most beloved figures in the world, told in his 60s that he was no longer welcome in the place he called home. He settled in Switzerland with his family, and there, at last, something like peace found him. He continued to work. He continued to create. And in 1972, in a moment that still moves people who watch the footage today, he returned briefly to the United States to accept an honorary Academy Award and received a standing ovation reported to be the longest in the ceremony's history. 12 minutes by most accounts. 12 minutes of a room full of strangers telling a 76-year-old man that everything he had given them had mattered. He passed away in 1977 on Christmas morning at his home in Switzerland, surrounded by family. What Charlie Chaplin left behind was not simply a body of films, though the films themselves remain extraordinary. What he left behind was proof of something many of us come to understand only with time, that our hardest years do not have to be wasted years, that the very things which nearly broke him, hunger, instability, humiliation, the fear of losing everything, became, in his hands, the raw material of a character who gave comfort to millions of people who were struggling with exactly those same feelings. Picture that boy again, standing outside the workhouse gate, watching the world with quiet, careful eyes. He could not have known in that moment what all that watching would become. Perhaps that's worth sitting with for a moment. Pause. How much of what shapes us doesn't announce itself as important while it's happening. It simply happens quietly, and we understand its meaning only decades later, looking back. If there is a single lesson in the life of Charlie Chaplin, it may be this: dignity is not something that is given to us by our circumstances. It is something we choose to carry, even when, especially when, circumstances offer us none. The tramp shuffled through poverty and disaster with his shoulders back and his cane twirling, not because he had won, but because he had decided quietly not to be defeated by what he hadn't won. Perhaps you've faced a season like that yourself, one that felt at the time like it might undo you, and which you carried through anyway, one small act of dignity at a time. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear in the comments what part of his life moved you most, or which story from a life like this you'd like to hear told next. Thank you for spending this time with me today.